So we're going to be looking at strategies for engaging people in the lifestyle changes needed to reach net zero emissions. So I guess the first question is why do we even need to do this? Isn't reaching net zero emissions all about decarbonising the electricity grid? Isn't it about installing wind farms, installing solar panels, perhaps changing the way we heat our homes from a fossil fuel powered boiler to a low carbon heat source? And the answer is yes, we do need to do all these things. We do need to reduce the amount of emissions we produce when we make electricity, when we produce goods, when we produce services. But we also need to reduce the amount of energy that we consume and reduce the number of goods that we consume, or at least consume goods in a more sustainable way. And this reduction of consumption, or changing the way that we consume, is going to involve some element of behavioural change on our part, on the part of every individual citizen. And actually, it's this behavioural piece of the puzzle, it's this behavioural change piece of the net zero puzzle that is the bigger component. So if we look at this stat from the Climate Change Committee, we see that they say that 62% of the changes required to reach net zero will be at least in part behavioural or social. And the Climate Change Committee are the UK government's official climate change advisors. They kind of sit to the side of government, they're civil servants, they're policy experts, and their job is to tell the UK government what they need to do to reach net zero. And they're saying that the majority of changes will be at least in part behavioural or social. So what kind of behavioural or lifestyle changes do you think we need to make to reach net zero? And this is a question I'd like to throw out to you guys. What sort of things do we need to change, do you think? Does anyone fancy suggesting some of the things we might need to change?
Yeah, less car driving.
Sure, definitely. Anyone got any other ideas?
How we heat our houses.
Sorry, what was that?
How we heat our houses.
Yep.
Our diets and how we farm.
Sure, yeah, that's another big one.
Our consumer choices.
Yep, particularly in terms of maybe buying things that last longer and buying less stuff. Definitely.
Yeah, and buying only what we need.
Yes.
Be more circular, yeah.
So
Maybe
what's that?
Be more circular.
Yeah.
Less plastics.
So you've kind of got all the main ones there. So
and what about travel? Foreign travel, foreign holidays. No, not going on foreign holidays.
yeah, aviation is an interesting issue, and I'm gonna sort of talk a bit more about that and explain how that's slightly different from the perspective that we're taking today. But you've covered them all really. So net zero scenarios all involve a reduction in the amount of meat that we consume, the amount of dairy that we consume, the amount of car miles that we drive, the amount of food waste that we produce, and the amount of waste that we produce from all other sources. And
hello, Dave speaking.
Sorry?
Oh, hi, Margaret. No, that's fine.
So
we might need to mute Dave.
David, do you mind sticking yourself on mute, David?
Joe.
Thank you. And just going back to aviation, it's worth explaining why that's not on the list. So according to the Climate Change Committee, we can actually increase the amount we fly by 25% from now until 2050 and still hit net zero, which is a slightly controversial take on aviation emissions. Not all the experts agree with that, but I've decided not to include that because I feel like I'm on safe ground repeating what the Climate Change Committee have said because they're such an authoritative source. So we need to reduce the amount of meat we consume, the amount of dairy that we consume, the amount of cars, miles we drive, the amount of food waste we produce, the amount of all other kinds of waste we produce. And we can actually dig into this in more detail and attach numbers to each of these things, which is worth doing because it starts to show us the scale of the challenge. So if we look, so meat, I'm going to come back to meat because I had a little quiz leading up to this when I was sending you all my endless reminders, which I apologize for. But dairy, we need to reduce our consumption of dairy by 20% by 2030 approximately. We need to reduce the amount of car miles we drive by 9% by 2035 and by 17% by 2050. We need to reduce the amount of food waste we produce by half by 2030. And we need to reduce the amount of all other kinds of waste that we produce by a third by 2037. Now, going back to meat, I asked you a multiple choice question when I was sending you the login details and the reminders. And I thought it might be fun just to have that question again because not everyone responded. So I'm just going to share a poll which has that question again, and it's a multiple choice question, and see if you can just select which answer you think is correct, and then I'll do the big reveal. So launching poll, so you should be able to see that now. And I'll just give you a little bit of time to put your answer in. So I can see there's still two people left. One person left to answer. Maybe they've gone to the toilet. Okay, I'm going to end the poll. Share results. So actually most of you said 30%, and the second largest number said 35%. So you're all pretty close, because so let me just close that. Because the answer is 35%. We need to reduce the amount of meat we consume by 35% by 2050. And this is again, according to the Climate Change Committee. And perhaps more challengingly, by 20% by 2030. So I think there's a few things we can take from these numbers. The first thing is that these changes are big. You know, reducing food waste by a half, reducing meat consumption by over a third, reducing the amount of all other kinds of waste we produce by a third. They're big changes that we need to make. And the second thing is that they have to be made pretty quickly. You know, reducing the amount of food waste we produce by a half by 2030, which is actually only 8.5 years away. Reducing the amount of meat and dairy we consume by a fifth in 8.5 years. So we have to make big changes quickly. And the third thing is that they're changes to things which form part of our identities. So if we think about cars, in our society, cars are kind of loaded with cultural meaning. We use them to signify our wealth, our status, our personalities. So people are loath to give them up because they feel like they're sacrificing part of themselves. And similarly, to a certain extent with diets, you know, to certain men, eating meat is part of their masculine identity. And to become vegan or vegetarian, or even just to reduce the amount of meat they eat, would make them feel like they're almost changing their personalities, which sounds like a bit of a silly thing to say, but it's true. So already we can see that we've got quite a big task on our hands when it comes to persuading people to make the changes that we need to reduce emissions and achieve net zero. But it doesn't end there, because the stuff that we've talked about so far is pretty easy to do from a technological point of view. You know, it's easy to eat a plant-based dish rather than a meat-based dish. It's easy to walk from a technical point of view rather than driving. But even where there's a technological solution, even the technological components of net zero, there may also be a behavioural change element attached to that. So to give you an example, if we think of home heating, which someone mentioned earlier, that's a technical change. You know, we need to swap our gas-powered, we have pretty cold weather in the UK, or a temperate climate where we have home heating, and we need to change our fossil fuel powered boilers to low carbon heat sources. But we can't, as policymakers and climate advocates, break into people's houses and install air source heat pumps. People need to choose to do these things, so they need to be engaged in the issues, and they need to want to do them, and they need to want to spend their money on them. So there's a big engagement component to that as well. So when you begin to put all this together, it can start to feel like we've got a bit of a mountain to climb when it comes to persuading people to make the changes that we need them to make. And if we don't go about it in the right way, we can actually exacerbate the problem. So initiatives to achieve these things can be met with apathy or resistance unless we communicate them really carefully. And a good example of that is what's happened recently in London with the rollout of low traffic neighbourhoods and more widely across the UK with cycle lanes. You know, the introduction of these things has been hugely acrimonious and has resulted in real polarisation of people on opposite sides of the argument, and the people opposing them, their positions have become really entrenched and they're arguably harder to shift. And this is partly because these things have been rolled out quickly without a lot of consultation, which hasn't been the fault of the council because it was something they were required to do to allow people to get about in a socially distanced way. So we can exacerbate the problem if we don't do these things correctly. And I'd like to ask you guys whether you have experienced any pushback in your work and things you've tried to advocate for, any changes in the context of climate change that you've tried to advocate for, and what pushback have you experienced? Is there anyone who is happy to share their story or talk about any resistance that they've encountered?
Hi, yeah. We, about 12 months ago, rolled out a new electric scooter trial in Taunton. And yeah, a lot of pushback. We had a lot of resistance before they even went live to say they're going to cause a menace, they're going to be on the paths, they aren't going to be used, they're going to be abandoned, lots of negativity. And to be fair, we've done really well with them. I think the distance travelled is around the world 1.5 times so far. So you imagine the impact on the climate from where we haven't driven cars for that. It's fantastic. Mm-hmm. We're still getting obviously resistance. We do with anything. I think half the problem is it's because it's a council. There is almost a mentality to fight the council at everything they do anyway with a lot of people, which is mm-hmm. to me a bit bizarre. Mm-hmm. But yeah, we're also looking to roll out change our fleet to electric vehicles. And there's resistance on that already as well. We are installing electrical chargers in car parks mm-hmm. Across our district. We've had a bit of resistance in that, and the fact that they need bigger spaces, so they're mm-hmm. saying there's less places for cars to park. There's less space as there is already. We've had road closures where we pedestrianised the roads. In order to make them a cleaner, safer environment for people to shop and enjoy our towns in an experience. Definitely a lot of feedback and pushback on that, because people have their what's the word I'm looking for? They have their routines, and as soon as you disrupt those routines, and it becomes alien to them, mm-hmm. you do get that defense mechanism and that barrier push up, and walls go up, and you know it's. People are like, I've always driven that way, and now got to spend another 15 minutes stuck in traffic going around. Surely that's worse for the climate because I'm sat in the car for longer. So they almost use your reasons against you for what you're doing to justify what they see as their normality and what they want back.
Yeah, sure. I think transport is a particularly tricky area, I think, because our cities in the UK and elsewhere in the world have been really built around the motor car, and people are so accustomed to kind of getting their way as drivers that they feel really kind of triggered by anything that challenges that. So thanks for sharing that, Barry. So yeah, it can be difficult. It's really difficult. So what do we do? What can we do as policymakers and advocates and activists, or whatever we may be, to try and get people to change and bring them with us and not have this kind of negative reaction? And that is the subject of the rest of the workshop. So we're going to be looking at who is your audience. We're going to be looking at using co-benefits to speak to your audience's values, the importance of honesty, the role of trusted messengers, the use of restorative narratives, and the role of peer-to-peer communication. And hopefully all these things should be clear to you by the end of the workshop. So who are your audience? Should we be trying to persuade all of the public at the same time, or should we be focusing on a subset of the public? Now, we would argue that it's worth paying particular attention to a subset of the public. And this subset can be described as those having centre-right political views. And I'd just like to share this quote with you. So, those with right of centre political views and low pro-environmental values tend to be most sceptical about the reality and severity of climate change. And so it follows from this, I think, that if they're sceptical about the reality and severity of climate change, they're also going to be pretty sceptical about doing anything about it, about initiatives to address emissions. So people on the centre-right represent quite a sort of hard nut to crack when it comes to behaviour change and getting people to take action on climate change. But not only that, they represent a pretty kind of hefty demographic. So to give you a couple of examples, this is kind of circumstantial evidence. But if you look at the most popular media outlets and newspapers in the UK, they're all right-leaning. And if we look at politics, the most successful political party in England, at least, I know you guys in Scotland have a slightly different political culture, but in England, the most successful political party by some margin is the party on the right, it's the Conservatives, who've been in power for 46 out of the last 70 years, I think, and are described here as the world's most successful party. So people who may be considered to be on the centre-right are a hard nut to crack, and they're a pretty large chunk of our population. So if we can focus on this group and bring them around, we've kind of broken the back of the problem, and we're arguably in the home straight when it comes to persuading the public as a whole to get on board. So how do we get buy-in from this demographic? And a good way to start to answer this question is to think, what influences our own behaviours and choices? Because we're all human, essentially. And this is another question I'd like to get you guys involved in. I'm going to do that by launching another poll. And I've got a list of things which may have a big influence on your own behaviour and choices. And I want you to choose the 2 things which you think have the most influence on your behaviour and choices. Hang on. So, launch poll. So hopefully you guys can see that, and you should, I hope I've set this up right and you'll be able to choose more than one thing. I've got a bad feeling I haven't now. So if you can only choose one thing, choose the one thing which has the most influence. So I can see 2 people still haven't voted. One person still hasn't voted. Okay, I'm gonna end poll. Share results. So hopefully you can all see that. So a third of you chose science and facts as having the most influence on your own choices and behaviours, followed closely by family and upbringing. So it's really handy, actually, that most of you chose science and facts, because it makes my next point seem really appropriate. So thanks for that. But there's a bit of a spread. So friends and peers had the least influence, which is interesting. So really, all of those things have some influence on our behaviours. But it's interesting that you put science and facts first. So let's just go see if I can get rid of this. Sorry, I can just see the poll on my screen and I can't get rid of it. Stop sharing. Sorry about this. So I'd just like to, so following on from that, science and the facts was your top pick when it came to what influences you the most. But according to this study published in Nature Climate Change, too much policy is based on oversimplifications and erroneous assumptions. For example, the assumption that informing individuals about climate change science is sufficient to affect decisions and behaviours. So what this is telling us, that banging people over the head with science and facts, with climate science, isn't enough to get people to change their decisions and behaviours. So if this doesn't work, then what does work? What is influential? What will work to try and persuade people to change their lifestyles and their behaviours? Well, according to the social scientists, communications and engagement strategies should be grounded in the audience's identity and values. And another way of explaining this is that communication strategies to get people to change their behaviours should be built from the bottom up rather than the top down. So to give you an example, imagine that there's a planning application to build a factory that constructs wind turbines in your area, and there's some local resistance to this. People think there'll be more lorries on the road, it'll be noisy, it'll be dusty, whatever it may be, but there's local resistance. So a bottom-up strategy to try and bring people round would seek out the audience's values and identity and build their messages from there. So you may say something like this. You may say, look, the UK has a proud tradition of innovation and leading industrial change, and this is just part of that. This is a continuation of that. So you're speaking to your audience's values of patriotism and continuing traditions, whereas a top-down approach would be to take the policy target and use that as a kind of stick to beat people into submission. So we might say, look, we have to do this kind of thing because we need to meet the UK's obligations under the Paris Agreement. But if you look at the bottom down approach, that's going to have much more kind of resonance and emotional connection with your audience, and they're much more likely to get on board because of that. Whereas the top down approach is it's a technical and kind of uninspiring motivation for most people. So what we need to do is try and identify our audience's values and build communication strategies which speak to those values, which chime with those values. So what are centre-right values? Well, these are some things that have been identified as being values that people on the centre-right have. A belief in the importance of family, a belief in looking after your health, a sense of attachment to your locality. So you might be a proud Yorkshireman or a proud Scotsman or a proud person from Somerset. I'm not sure what someone from Somerset is called. Barry, I don't know if you could help me with that.
I wouldn't know myself, if I'm honest,
No,
Rick.
Somerset.
I'm just from Somerset. That's all I'm saying. So
okay, I was just curious. I was hoping you might have an answer. Pride in your nation, a belief in perhaps they're religious, so that might be important to them. A belief in protecting the countryside, but often that's like a particular kind of aesthetic ideal of the countryside. So pretty chocolate box villages, dry stone walls, not kind of wild nature. A belief in preserving cultural traditions, conservative with a small c, so wary of novelty and change and liking the status quo, being opposed to waste, unnecessary waste, and liking a clean environment. So that's kind of things like being opposed to graffiti and littering. So these are the kind of values that we need to speak to. And another way of looking at that is that engagement strategies should encourage choices that reduce emissions by framing them as being in pursuit of these values. So we need to construct messages and engagement strategies that frame climate action as being in pursuit of these values. So how do we do that? And one big way we can do that is by emphasizing the co-benefits of action on climate change. Now, co-benefits are all these other lovely things that happen when we take action to reduce emissions. Can anyone say what they think some of the co-benefits might be of taking action on climate change, of some of the policies we have to do, some of the things we have to do?
Protecting your family's future.
Sure. What about benefits when it comes to the sort of physical world, the physical environment?
Health.
Yep, health. That's a big one.
more green areas, better place to live.
Yeah, yeah. definitely. Restoring nature.
Green economic recovery.
Yeah, economic benefit, definitely. That's what I'm going to mention. So thanks for those. They're all things I'm going to say right now. So this is not an exhaustive list, but these are some of the co-benefits of some of the measures we need to take to reduce emissions. So if we take cars off the road, for example, if we reduce the number of cars on the road, we not only cut greenhouse gas emissions, but we also reduce all the other nasty stuff that comes out of exhausts that causes premature deaths in the UK and also around the world. If we perhaps have a scheme to absorb carbon by planting trees, we also maybe restore ecosystems and give biodiversity a big boost. If we eat less meat and dairy, we improve our health. If we cycle more, we improve our health. If we cut waste to reduce emissions, we're also reducing the physical waste in the environment. So perhaps we're lessening the amount of plastic waste that is floating around in our oceans. As Claire said, if we invest in green infrastructure, in the green economy, we give our economy a boost. And there's often lots of financial savings to be made by taking action on climate change. If we drive less, we save on parking, we save on petrol. If we go car free, that's a huge saving. If we let meat and dairy are expensive, we save on our groceries if we reduce that. So these are some of the co-benefits of action on climate change. And what co-benefits do is they provide a kind of bridge between the values of our audience, the values of those on the centre right, and emission reduction, so that if we trumpet the co-benefits of taking action, what happens is we speak to our audience's values, which means they're more likely to take the action we want. And we get the co-benefits, but we also get the emission reduction at the same time. So to give you a couple of examples, say, for example, we're trying to get people to drive less to cut road emissions. One way we can do that is by really trumpeting the co-benefit of that. Say, look, we're going to cut the pollution, local pollution, nasty stuff that comes out of people's exhaust, the particulate matter, the nitrogen dioxide, which causes respiratory disease, it causes cardiovascular disease, it causes birth defects, it causes loads of nasty stuff. And by trumpeting that, we're going to speak to our audience's values of looking after their health, of looking after their family, and particularly their children, if we think of the amount of pollution that's outside schools during drop-off. And we speak to those values, they're more likely to take the action we want, and we get the co-benefit, but we also get the climate objective at the same time. Another quick example, say we're trying to get people to support a scheme that's going to sequester carbon, it's going to absorb carbon. We want to take an area of land in your local authority area and plant loads of trees and to absorb carbon. One way of getting people on board might be to say something like, look, we're gonna provide really lovely habitat for hedgehogs. This sounds silly, but it's really not. Bear with me. We're gonna give habitat to hedgehogs, which are actually on the verge of extinction in the UK. And this would arguably speak to the centre-right values of preserving the countryside, preserving an ideal of the countryside in which hedgehogs thrive, and also perhaps speaking to their value of preserving our cultural traditions, because hedgehogs occupy a place which is closest to our nation's heart. If you think of Beatrix Potter, Mrs. Tiggywinkle, speak to their values. Never thought I'd say Mrs. Tiggywinkle in a workshop on climate change, but we speak to their values. They're more likely to do it. We get the co-benefit, but we also get the climate objective at the same time. So co-benefits are a really handy way to get people on board, to trumpet things in a way which appeals to our audience. And I'd just like to give you a quick real world example of this sort of approach. So there was a scheme in Scotland to buy a huge amount of land from an aristocratic landowner, the Buccleuch estate, and put it into community ownership. And in many ways, this was a really kind of novel and new thing. It was a really bold, ambitious scheme. You don't get community land buyouts very often. This was a really big one. And they wanted to create a nature reserve. That was the main thing they wanted to do. But if we look at this quote, they're not talking about it being a bold, new, ambitious scheme. And they're not even talking about it becoming a nature reserve. They're saying, They're talking about community, having a strong cultural connection to the land, about securing it for generations. So they're speaking to a centre-right audience. They're saying, look, this is something that is preserving a tradition. They're not talking about nature or it being new. They're speaking to values of attachment to a sense of place and preserving traditions. And I don't think it's any accident that they used that kind of language. So to summarize, co-benefits allow climate action to be framed as fulfilling centre-right values and sense of identity. But not only that, there's another big benefit. What co-benefits allow us to do is to frame climate action as fulfilling those values in the here and now. So if we think about climate change and trying to get people to do things for the sake of climate change, often we're asking them to do something for which they will not see the reward for a very long time. So, we might say, look, we need to do this to hit net zero in 2050, or we need to do this so that global warming is limited to 1.5 degrees by the end of the century. No, the returns on their action are really a long way off. And, in terms of the end of the century, often after people's lifetimes, and that's not hugely incentivizing having that huge kind of delayed gratification. Whereas what co-benefits do is make people feel that they're going to get the benefits of their action almost immediately. We take cars off the road, local pollution is cut almost straight away. We restore ecosystems, biodiversity bounces back pretty much, in the short term. We cycle more, we walk more, our health improves straight away. So they allow people to feel that they're going to get the benefit of things that they prioritize almost immediately. So I know that was a lot, but thanks for staying with me. And now I want to throw it over to you, and we're going to have a quick exercise now. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to split you into groups, and I want you to choose one of these actions that you may be advocating for and think about what the co-benefits are and which centre-right values they appeal to. And so we can start to think about what co-benefits we can use to appeal to the values of those on the centre-right and get them to do these things. So you maybe want to do a quick screen grab or photo of this slide so that you can look at it when you're in the breakout rooms. And I'll try and share this slide while you're in the room so you can see what questions I want you to answer. So let me see if I can set the rooms up now. So how many rooms should I do? Maybe 5 rooms. So there should be, no, 4, let's say. Right, so I'm gonna stick you in rooms now. So choose one of the actions that you can see on the slide, hopefully, and then answer this question: what are the co-benefits and which centre-right values do they appeal to? So I'll give you a few minutes to talk about that, and then I'll bring you back, and we can hopefully hear from some of you what you've come up with. So I'm going to create the rooms now.
That was way too short.
Was it? Sorry.
That wasn't long at all, no.
Short but sweet. Yeah.
Okay, I maybe should have left you in for longer. Did you have enough to come up with some things that you're able to?
Not really.
No?
Got a couple of things.
We had a couple.
Yeah.
We've got a lot to cover this morning, so group work is always time consuming, so it's fair to keep us moving along quickly, I think.
Yeah.
Thanks for being on my side. Yeah, sorry, I'm a bit conscious of the time. But if anyone feels that they did get somewhere and are able to share some of the things that they discussed, if they I should have asked you to name a spokesperson, but if anyone fancies nominating themselves, just to say which activity they chose and what some of the co-benefits might be and what values they think they appeal to, that would be brilliant, just to contribute something. I'm sorry for cutting it short.
We talked about people saving money, and we also talked about potentially less waste hanging around for vermin, and also we said that people will get a sense of being efficient and well organized.
Which activity did you choose, Tim? Which one?
Why not?
What were you trying to get people to do?
Food waste.
It was reduce the food waste.
Okay. Yeah. Yep. Money's an obvious co-benefit there. We're going to talk a little bit more about that in a second.
The other benefit of reducing food waste might be that you reduce the amount of imported food.
Sure. So there could be some carbon savings there.
We kind of we were doing the food waste, and we sort of said, obviously there's a lot of benefits like reducing transport from deliveries, etc. Also reducing like the carbon and the cost on the recycling side of things. So if there's less recycling going out, they don't have to go back to wherever they're recycling to, so landfill, etc. But we didn't really see that as a co-benefit for the people who would be buying less, because they don't really see that side of things, so that makes sense. So it was yeah, they are benefits, and they are benefits for now, but they're not direct benefits for the people actually who actually buy less and are creating less food waste. Does that make sense?
Yeah. So then they're not co-benefits that necessarily speak to people's values. I think food waste is a tricky one. I think you'd have to focus on the kind of negative aspects of there being such a kind of almost obscene amount of waste. The amount of, and appealing to people's sense of wanting to waste less, because the amount of food waste that we generate as a society in the UK and other Western societies is really kind of obscene. So I think tapping into that sense of the kind of obscenity of the amount of food waste that we produce would be one way to go. But I think food waste is definitely one of the trickier things out of the four choices you had there. Did anyone choose anything else that they'd like to, that they feel able to talk about briefly? Any other climate action that their group looked at?
I think in group 3 we had a quick chat about the cycling to work topic. We didn't have a lot of in-depth analysis of this, but I think very much touching on the points that you actually mentioned in the presentation earlier. So very much around increasing personal health, getting activity encapsulated in people's daily lives, and also the huge health benefits of the reduction in pollution and so on. So those seem to be the two big areas that were worth focusing, and those very much speak to the sort of core health domain in terms of centre-right values. I haven't worked out how to formulate it, but there's something there perhaps around efficiency and economic benefit benefits, in terms of swapping to cheaper methods of transport as well. I'm not quite sure how to present that, but I think there is something there as well, although we didn't really explore that. But there could be a sort of financial come economic value to address there. I think the one thing I mentioned to the others in the group was I think these are points that probably everyone involved in campaigning for sustainable travel does try to make these days. But I wonder if there's a danger or there's a mistake perhaps that we make, which is at some point we always seem to end up pivoting to meeting climate change targets in our discussions. And I wonder if that's the point at which any benefit you've gained by talking about health and pollution reduction is just gets thrown out the window because people's attention just they're far left tree huggers. Let's just ignore them.
It's a tricky one. So going just to cover you a couple of points there. So the health thing, I think that's somewhere where you could get a decent bit of leverage in when it comes to transport and people who are on the centre right, because I think there's probably an overlap between people who have centre right views and people who are maybe from a slightly older demographic and are starting to think about their health and their mortality. So I think health is something you could get some leverage on when it comes to trying to get people out of their cars and choosing more active modes of transport. In terms of kind of undermining yourself by talking about the climate change targets, I think that's a possibility, but we're going to talk later on about how you do also need to be honest with people, I think, about the situation we're in as a civilization and the scale of the challenge of climate change. And we're going to discuss that more a bit later. But thanks for that. It was Niall, wasn't it? Thanks for that, Niall. Does anyone else fancy able to say something from a different group, or did I just not give you enough time to get anywhere, which I apologise for.
It's okay.
Okay, I'll move on. Next time I'll give people longer. I apologise again for that. So I think I've just got a final word on co-benefits, and then we're going to move on to something slightly different. So you talked about money, and as we said earlier, taking action on climate change is often there are often a lot of economic savings. As we discussed, it's obviously cheaper to walk than it is to drive. Meat products, dairy products are kind of more expensive side of people's groceries. There's even savings on things like insulating your home in the long run. So you would think that making an economic argument for taking the kind of actions we need people to take would be a good starting point, a good kind of direction to go. But I would just give a kind of word of caution of taking that approach, or at least exclusively taking that approach. And I just want to share this quote quickly. Research shows that non-financial factors, such as the symbolic value of a behaviour as an expression of identity or status, may have greater effects on adoption and use than prices and costs. So getting people to do things because they feel it reflects the things that they think important is a more powerful method than just saying, look, you're going to save a few quid. But not only that, if climate change isn't on people's radar, or if other reasons aren't on people's radars and they're only doing things to save money, then you have something called the rebound effect, or you potentially do. So if choices are motivated by financial gains alone, then any money that people save, they may spend on other high carbon behaviours, potentially more polluting behaviours. So say people, I don't know, save money by driving less. Maybe they save that money and they take a flight to Buenos Aires instead. You have to drive a lot less to save that amount of money. But the point is, we need other things to be on people's radars other than money. Otherwise, they might spend any savings on stuff that's just as bad or worse. Which brings us on quite nicely to the next point, which also kind of speaks to what Niall was saying about talking about climate change. We, as well as using co-benefits to kind of make things seem attractive to people on the centre right and people across the political spectrum, we also need to still tell the truth about climate change. And the strategies that we're sharing today, that we're talking about today, aren't a kind of either or thing. They're not mutually exclusive. You don't have to do one thing and not to be able to do any of the others. They're kind of, they should kind of aggregate and complement each other and build up to a more powerful argument, ideally. Although I understand it's interesting what Niall was saying about climate change undermining other arguments. If you do it in the right way, it shouldn't do that. Because, you know, this is really a kind of arguably an existential threat that we're facing, and this is relevant to everyone. So we still need to tell the truth about climate change. And what does that mean, as Extinction Rebellion are kind of saying here? But what does that mean? Well, it means a couple of things. Firstly, we still have to show what's at stake. We still have to join the dots between the climate action we want people to take and what we're seeking to avert, which is catastrophic climate change. So we need to say to people, look, we need to do this to avoid these catastrophic climate change impacts that we could be in line for if we don't take action. And when we're talking about the impacts and teaching people or telling people about the impacts we could be in line for if we don't take serious action, we don't need to talk about the impacts that are kind of decades into the future. Where we can, we should show the impacts are happening now in places that people care about. So we need to say to people, look, sorry, someone's just turned up just now, so I'm going to admit them and hope they can get something out of the remainder of it. We need to say, look, the impacts are happening now where you live, and if we don't take action, they're only going to get more severe. And it's worth bearing in mind, I think, that the central benefit of taking action on climate change, i.e. averting catastrophic climate change, also chimes with centre-right values and everyone's values, really. We're facing this huge crisis and everyone wants to protect their family and their children. And when it comes to the centre-right, there is a sense of intergenerational duty of doing the right thing for future generations, for our children, our grandchildren. So we can speak to those values by talking about the threat that we're facing. And the other way that we need to tell the truth is really to spell out to people what's required. You know, we can't expect people to reduce their food waste by half or their dairy consumption by 20% if they don't know that they have to do that. So don't be afraid to go into the detail. You know, we need to, if we want people to reduce their meat consumption by 20%, they need to know that they have to do that. They're not going to do it if they don't know that they have to do that. So centre-right audiences are often willing to do their bit given the appropriate justification by a trusted messenger. So we can really lean on that idea of doing their bit. You know, the people in this kind of demographic believe in everyone doing their fair share, everyone bearing their share of the burden. So we can use that kind of language to get buy-in from this demographic. But as the quote says, given the appropriate justification by a trusted messenger. So it's really important who is doing the asking, who the person is that's relaying the information to this audience. They have to be trusted by the audience. They have to be someone that they identify with. Because the social science tells us that the extent to which someone is willing to change depends more on who is asking than it does on the reasons that they're giving. So trusted messengers should be identified and enlisted in decarbonisation projects that engage with communities. So this is another, someone said David Attenborough in the chat, we've got him here. So this is another question I want to ask you guys. What makes a person trustworthy? What is going to make the messenger someone that the audience is going to identify with and believe and ultimately do what they're asking.
I think it's almost always, I think, for this particular demographic. Oh, sorry, you're going to put it into.
Yeah, I was going to ask you to do this and have a chat about this in groups, and I'll leave you longer to do it this time. I promise.
You just paused too long, Rick. I can.
No, sorry.
Silence.
It's because there was another 2 people in the waiting room, bizarrely. Sorry about that. Yeah, so I'm going to ask you to have a chat about this in groups. And then if you in your group would fancy nominating a spokesperson, when I bring you back, I'll ask some of you some of the things that you came up with. So let me go back to groups. Sorry, breakout rooms. How do I get rid of that? Sorry, Zoom technicalities. I don't know, I've just got the same screen that I had before. I'm just going to delete the old rooms. Sorry, just bear with me a second. So I'm putting you back into groups. I'm going to do it now.
We're back, Rick.
Okay, I'll just wait for everyone else to come back. Just a couple of groups that haven't come back yet. We'll just wait for them.
Sounds of the seaside there, Rick.
Yeah, the seagulls. I should probably close the window.
I think I heard an aeroplane a minute ago.
I'll maybe close one window.
It's ironic. You're on about air transport, and then I'm reducing it, and then you can hear the plane go over the top.
Yeah, I guess we're not too far from Gatwick here. I thought it's probably from there. Okay, so I think everyone is back. So does anyone, hopefully you nominate a spokesperson. Do any of the spokespeople fancy sharing some of the things that their group discussed, or some of the ideas that their group came up with?
Yeah, Rick, I'm happy to go. So we were group 1, and we were saying there's a few things. We were all quite skeptical, so we struggled actually to find something that makes someone's quite trustworthy. But a couple were probably geographical. So if they sort of, they come from the same area as you, they relate to the same way you are, your upbringing, you sort of said, yes, they live where I did. They've grown up the same way. I can trust what they're saying because they've lived the same sort of life I have. Another one would be your relationships. So whether it be a working one or a personal one, obviously you trust the people you love. You wouldn't expect them to lie to you.
Yeah.
And also in a working manner, you would hopefully believe that whoever you're working with was giving you as an open and as trustworthy information and facts as possible. We did say experts to a degree and people in power, but obviously after the weekend we've just seen, sometimes when you have, say, one person who does something which is a scandal or is completely against something you believe in, you kind of tend to tar everyone in that sort of group with the same brush.
Mm-hmm.
So it makes it very, very hard sometimes. And also when experts predict the future, your skepticism says, well, it's the future. No one can predict that. No one can know for certain. Prime example was Brexit, when they said the economy would go bust, and actually it was the reverse, and it boomed quite well. So those sort of things, we were on the fence with experts in that manner.
Yeah.
We also said things like appearance. So David Attenborough is a prime example. He always wears a blue shirt and beige trousers. So it's a familiarity of someone, and the fact that you always get the same from them. So it'd be the same appearance, the same tone. The way he speaks, there's no jargon. He doesn't try and bamboozle you with facts and figures. He puts it in a manner you can relate to. So they were the kind of things that we came across which makes someone trustworthy.
Definitely, yeah, quite a good list there. Certainly, what you said at the start, I would agree with. Yeah, so a kind of rule of thumb for a trusted messenger, maybe someone who is just like their audience. People sympathise with and relate to and empathise with people who are like them. And yeah, experts are an interesting one. I've never noticed what David Attenborough wears, so that's an interesting observation that he always wears the same colours.
There's a thing around colour, isn't there, about people trusting dark blues and stuff. That's why you always see banks with those colours.
Oh right, I didn't know that.
Yeah, no, I noticed it yesterday. I was talking to someone I know who's a clown, essentially, with this dark blue background and had his hair cut, and he definitely looked more trustworthy than usual.
Maybe I'll try that next time I'm doing one of these. Any other group?
Yeah, we put sort of celebrities, like loads of campaigns have celebrities, people that are well known, local leaders and spokespeople, people with local connections. I talked about children, so kids talking to their parents. I was thinking about Greta Thunberg and that school movement, you know, that pester power, that idea. Someone with their own experience, whatever it is, you know, like a farmer talking about the flooding, that sort of stuff.
Mm-hmm.
Someone who's a good communicator, someone that you know, friend or neighbour.
Mm-hmm.
And then I did like the appearance thing, but I've also put the difference about being face to face rather than on social media, I suppose.
It's interesting you said celebrities. Is that trust or is that aspiration? Do people follow celebrities because they trust them or because they aspire to have their lifestyles?
I think there's a knowledge of who they are, really, isn't it? It's about them cutting through other stuff. So it's, you know, while everyone's talking, there are certain people who have a louder voice just because they're already known. They're sort of access to you know, the media or something, maybe.
Mm-hmm.
It's a strange one, Karen, because I don't trust celebrities. I think they jump on a bandwagon to increase their popularity. So I don't tend to have any sort of trust in what they're saying. It's almost when the Toyota Prius came out. Do you remember? And it was supposed to be a very green car and everything. And all of a sudden, all these celebrities had a Toyota Prius in their garage, and everyone was making a note of the fact that they had a Toyota Prius. But we all knew that when the camera wasn't there, it was parked up collecting dust in the garage, and they would go out in, you know, one of their super sports cars or whatever. It would, you know, I am very skeptical. It's weird because I work in climate and I am very skeptical of everyone. It's the same with politicians.
Certain people, like, I mean, obviously David Attenborough is a classic. Chris Packham is another one. You know, there are certain people. The kind of world of conservation has its own celebrities. I mean, all those Springwatch, all of that, all of those people as well. Those kind of people.
Yeah. So it's absolutely so. Yeah. So I'm saying again, it's not just that genre. Again, it's like with politicians or with yeah. You have your genre of celebrities. You wouldn't trust them all. So being a celebrity doesn't make them trustworthy, so to speak. It's what they do as that celebrity which makes them the trustworthy, not the fact that they are a celebrity. Does that make sense?
It's a moot point, but yes, it's. I'm not necessarily saying all celebrities. I mean, I wouldn't necessarily. No. Climate emergency, for example, but you know, I think that it's. It gives them a larger voice. It's just our list.
Yes.
Well, it's partly the celebrities' record, isn't it? If you think of Marcus Rashford, a lot of people know that Marcus Rashford has put a lot of effort into helping poor kids. So that record goes with him before he even opens his mouth.
Yeah, again though, I'm very skeptical. Marcus Rashford, who demanded the government pay X amount towards school meals out of taxpayers' money, yet earns a far, far more amount than any of us will ever see, who could have quite happily dipped his hand in his pocket and paid X amount himself. So again, I'm quite skeptical. So,
but the fact
I think from our point of view, we probably have to set our sights slightly lower. The chances of us getting Marcus Rashford or someone to speak on our behalf is unlikely. It's a really interesting discussion, though. Celebrities are an interesting one. They do cut through. I think. I mean, when I think of celebrities and how they're used, it's the kind of influencer culture, and I think it's a more of an aspirational motivation that gets people to follow them, looking more broadly beyond the climate sphere rather than necessarily trusting them. But there are some really trustworthy celebrities that have been mentioned, like, you know, David Attenborough, obviously, and Chris Packham, who is kind of genuinely an activist. You know, he really believes this stuff. He kind of puts his head on the block a little bit with the stuff he does outside of work. Does anyone else have anything?
Yes, I wanted to. So in our group, we also talked about personalities, and I think the point that came before personalities was that we were saying that someone trustworthy can be someone that is an approved peer. It can be someone really close, someone that we trust because they share the same value as us, because we value their opinion for that. And I think when we look at indeed personalities, what the media built as personalities, we talked about also the genuineness or the authenticity that some people recognize in some of these personalities, even though they don't have any particular expertise in the domain that they speak about. And that's just my personal add-on onto this conversation, that I feel we all project something on the people. We can't know the people inside out. We project something on people, we project our values. So for me, it relates again to what values we recognize in the people that we see, and the image that they project in the media, and then attaching to those people, saying, okay, well, and we do all function differently, but some people do function like that, and this is how they're going to give that trust to some of those people. And we're also talking about how the gain credibility of a personality in their core expertise can actually influence our perception of them speaking up in another topic that is not within their expertise. And lastly, we also talked about how some people come in the radar of becoming a trustworthy person on a topic because suddenly they stand up, they have the courage to embody a message or value that is important to a majority, but is kind of not speaking about by anybody. So this kind of like hero, like if you wish, posture.
Mm-hmm. So a few things there. So if I interpreted what you were saying correctly, you're kind of saying that it's partly to do with perhaps their charisma, their sort of personality, personal attributes. So that's really useful. Before we move on, does anyone else want to quickly chip in who feels they haven't said their piece?
Just a very brief point. We mentioned Greta Thunberg in group 3, actually perhaps as an example of someone who wouldn't be a trusted messenger for the sort of core centre-right audience that we were imagining, because she wouldn't appear to have the sort of shared values, experience, lifestyle, etc., etc. So for that group, she may be someone that you wouldn't want to have in that role, which I thought was an interesting discussion.
Yeah, she's a very sort of divisive figure. So she's got a huge kind of loyal, ardent supporters on one side, and then people who really despise her on the other. But there's no doubt she's been successful in kind of pushing it up the agenda. So thank you all for your contributions there. That's really interesting. I just want to share what we think makes up a trustworthy or a trusted messenger. And I've maybe given you, by having a photo of David Attenborough, I've realized perhaps given you a slightly wrong steer. Because what I'm thinking about this is in a kind of local campaigning context. So I'm guessing that most of the audience either perhaps work in local councils or are campaigning for things in a local context. So it's about, what I'm thinking about really is who we can get, who would be a trusted messenger in that context, and who we could kind of utilize and harness to forward whatever we're trying to do in the local context. And that's probably not going to be David Attenborough. It's probably going to be someone a bit more kind of prosaic than that. But so what makes a trusted messenger? These are some of the things that we've identified. So a trusted messenger will communicate in the language of common sense, which was mentioned. So not using jargon and not using any kind of highfalutin concepts. Have a shared identity with the audience. Not condescend to the audience. So not patronize. Speak to them on their kind of level, and address the concerns and values of the audience. And a shorthand for all of this, as I said earlier, is really someone like the audience, because people identify with, they relate to, they empathize with, they sympathize with people like themselves. So a rule of thumb is to try and use a messenger that is like the audience. And I found a really good example of this. what I thought was quite a good example on Twitter last week. So Transport for London, who, if anyone doesn't know, are the organisation that runs public transport in London, and they also run the congestion charging scheme and the ultra low emission zone, whereby vehicles are charged for entering London depending on their pollution levels. They're a huge body, have massive say over public transport in London, and they had this campaign on social media to try and get tradespeople to swap their vans for electric cargo bikes. And what they did was they got a plumber and interviewed him to talk about his experience of having done that, of having already swapped his van for electric cargo bike. And he's a really good example of a trusted messenger in that context, someone the audience is going to relate to, because he does the same job as them. He's going to understand the challenges that they face doing their job, perhaps from a similar social class, a similar sort of person. So he's a great trusted messenger for trying to do that, for trying to get people to swap their vans for cargo bikes. And there he is being interviewed. He's got his electric cargo bike on the back. In set, you can see him going off on a job with his vacuum cleaner on the back. Like all good tradesmen, he hoovers up after himself. So that's a real world example of a trusted messenger being used in practice. If anyone would like to look at that interview, just take a photo of the slide or screen grab of the slide and go to that URL address. So that's trusted messengers. I've forgotten where I was. There's one more thing I want to share. There's a couple of more things I want to share with you. Another thing we can do to help get people on board from a centre-right audience is use narratives that look to the past as well as the future. So we know that the centre-right believe in maintaining the status quo. They're wary of novelty and change. So I realise we're coming up against time constraints. They're wary of novelty and change, but it is possible to frame action on climate change as continuing traditions or restoring lost natural states, which may help to persuade people that it's not something new and novel, that it is continuing traditions and it is continuing the status quo. So to give you a couple of quick examples, if we look at these images, this is where I live in Hove. The first black and white image, that's, I'm guessing, early 20th century. The second image is in recent years. So if we're campaigning to get cars off the road or to reduce the numbers of cars off the road, one of the things we can say is, look, all we're doing is returning our cities to how they were designed to be. Our cities weren't designed to carry this volume of traffic. So we're really returning our cities and towns to how they were meant to be. Another context where this may be a useful approach is in farming. Now, farming is one of those sectors that's going to have to undergo a huge amount of change to achieve our climate change objectives, and farmers are kind of quite a tricky audience. Maybe because they're on the centre right, but also because farming is hard, and farmers are kind of between a rock and a hard place in many respects. You know, the only way to make farming work financially is to have industrial farming but then at the same time they're being asked to change. But presenting the change that they need to do as a continuing tradition might be a way to help bring them on board. So by switching from industrial farming to more sustainable practices is really just returning to the way that people's grandfathers farmed, being more in tune with the land, being more in tune with nature. And that kind of framing is maybe something that will help you persuade farmers to change. So we've looked at who our audience are. We've looked at how we can use co-benefits to get them on board. We've looked at the need to still tell the truth. We've looked at trusted messengers and at the role that they can play. We've looked at using narratives which look to the past and the future. What is missing, do you think? What haven't we talked about? What has a huge influence on our behaviour which we haven't yet touched upon? Can anyone think of something that has an influence on us all which we haven't really discussed?
Capitalism?
That's a big one. Yes. Changing capitalism may be out of the remit of this workshop. It's maybe something we need to do. That's not what I'm looking for. That is a really massive subject and is worth several workshops on itself.
Bringing more positive stories.
Yes, the use of positive stories. Definitely. That's something we could also discuss if there was more time. What I was aiming for, what I was hoping that you would bring up is, as humans, what has a huge influence on everything we do is our peer group, is our peers, which may be our family, our friends, our colleagues. Our peer group has a huge impact on what we see as acceptable, what we see as normal, and what we're prepared to do as individuals. So as climate activists or campaigners or policymakers, what we need to do is kind of harness that peer pressure. So to give you an example, imagine this is Dave. He's a plumber. He doesn't work for Hammersmith Heating. He works for Fulham Heating. He is concerned about his health. He's been to the doctors. The doctor says he's got high blood pressure, high cholesterol. He's thinking of changing his diet. He's thinking of maybe becoming vegetarian or even vegan. And he's really worried about doing this, because he's scared about what his friends will think. Will they think he's become some kind of tree-hugging hippie? Will they think he's kind of being effeminate by becoming a vegan? And that's what's holding him back. So imagine that scenario, and then imagine a scenario where Dave and all his friends have been persuaded to come to a public meeting. They've all been told about the benefits of reducing meat consumption. They all think, actually, it's not such a bad idea. Maybe I will do that. If that was the context, then Dave would be much more likely to say, look, I'm thinking of becoming vegetarian. He'd be much more likely to feel comfortable to say that, to do that, and much more likely to take the plunge. So what we need to do, one of the things we should be trying to do, is to encourage peer-to-peer communication, facilitating this, because this is what drives changes to social norms and makes people feel that they can make changes that otherwise they don't feel like they'd be able to make. So a quick scenario, imagine you work for a local council and you're trying to encourage tradespeople in your city to swap their vans for electric cargo bikes. How do you facilitate peer-to-peer communication? How do you get tradespeople together and talk about the issues, talk about why they need to do that, the benefits of doing that? What sort of forums could you encourage or organize, do you think? Does anyone fancy hazarding a guess or suggesting the sorts of ways of getting people together to talk about these things?
I think you've got to go. Yeah. Sorry, go ahead.
There might be some kind of trade body that they belong to or that they're registered with.
Yes, definitely, Tim. You kind of hit the nail on the head there. And I'll come back to that in a second. Alex, I think you were trying to jump in there.
I think using a trade body is a great idea. I think also it's got to be an event that actually has like a physicality to it, like so coming to be able to try something out, so that they can basically, it takes away the ability for someone to kind of say, oh, well, you'll never fit a toolbox in that, or you'll never fit this in that, or whatever else it might be. So you've got to have a way to kind of address the fact that people will either say you can't fit everything that I need to fit in it, and I'm too unhealthy, fat, tired, there's too many hills, it's too wet, all of those classic objections. You got to be able to demonstratively kind of like address that. That's a good idea from Niall. Cargo Bike Roadshow at Screwfix branch. I don't know, is Screwfix down south as well? But
yeah, that's a really good one. Yeah. So some of the cliched kind of forums that we have in the climate sphere, citizens' assemblies, workshops, public meetings, perhaps a social media campaign where you're targeting that group in a Facebook group. We can do these things, but as has been mentioned, the key thing is to seek people out and go to them. So find out where these people are. It's no use organising a meeting in the centre of town and advertising it to the usual suspects, people on the council, environmentalists, campaign groups, because you're not going to reach the audience that you need to reach. Similarly, sadly, with things like what we're doing now, London Climate Action Week. London Climate Action Week is a brilliant event for people already in the climate space to share ideas, to share knowledge, but we're not, I would guess reaching people who aren't already engaged in climate change. What we have to do is go and seek them out and find them. So it means, yeah, as Tim said, going to residents associations, going to local small business associations, going to sports clubs, going to Screwfix, great idea, and saying, look, can we organise this event? We want to speak to your members. We want to speak to your customers. Do you mind us organising this? So we have to go to them and find them. And when we organise these events, this is where the trusted messengers really come into their own, because you don't want to get in front of these audiences and then put an environmentalist in front of them, or you know, no offence, Barry and everyone else is from a local council, people from the council, or heaven forbid, a cycling campaigner. They don't want to hear from these people. They want to hear from trusted messengers. So this could be perhaps someone from the community, so perhaps a member of the community that you're speaking to who is sympathetic to your ideas and could advocate on your behalf. And this is sometimes called the block leader approach. Or someone who works in the same field. So looking back at that Transport for London video, getting someone who does the job that your audience does and getting them to say how making the changes worked for them and they could do it and it's fine and actually their life is better now. So to give another quick example, imagine in your town you want to pedestrianize part of the city centre. Either as a local council, this is a policy, or perhaps as campaigners, you supporting the council and you're trying to get people behind this. But the retailers, the shop owners, they're saying this is going to be the death of the high street. People won't be able to drive into town. They won't be able to park anywhere. We're going to lose footfall. We're going to lose revenue. This is a terrible idea. How do you get people? How do you turn them round? Who would be a brilliant trusted messenger in that context, do you think?
Maybe a councillor from a different town who they've already done it with stats to show that actually the footfall doesn't fall, with evidence to show that actually pedestrianising the area works. So someone with evidence of a positive story from it. Yeah, definitely. You're sort of halfway there. So yes, someone from another town, but better than that, if you could find a retailer who had been opposed to pedestrianisation and had perhaps even campaigned against it, but it had happened anyway, and had found that actually the footfall had increased, because that's actually what the evidence shows, that when you pedestrianise spaces, people want to go there more because they're more attractive and they spend more money. If you could find a shop owner from another town who had been opposed to it, but actually now he loves it because he's finding that people are coming more, they're spending more money. If you could, it's going to take a bit of research and perhaps a bit of use of the old Google, but that these people are out there. And if you could say to them, look, do you fancy coming to our meeting and talking to our shop owners, for 10 minutes, we'll pay your mileage, we'll pay your parking, or preferably your train fare, or we'll take you out for a curry, we'll buy you a bottle of the local wine because grapes grow here now, #climate change. They would be a perfect public trusted messenger in that context. So we need to facilitate peer-to-peer communication, but also if we can combine that with a trusted messenger, then we've got a really powerful campaign there potentially. And there's one last thing before we wrap up. I'm sorry I'm going over. I'm glad that you can stay. There's one last thing that I want to say, is that when we get people together and when we have these meetings, if we can, we should give them some power. And we have to have power in the first place to seed this power. So this arguably only applies to people who work on the council, but we should give power to the people. So the face-to-face engagement that we've got people together to do shouldn't just be a talking shop, because if people are able to think through the issues, if they're informed and they're able to contribute to decision-making, so they're able to have some say over what happens, then they're much more likely to be invested in the policy. They're much more likely to try and make it work. And councils and people in power more generally can be really reluctant to cede power, because I guess the danger is that if you give people power, how do you know they're going to do what you want them to do? But if we look at the experience of climate assemblies in the UK, we find that when people are informed
And when they're given some decision-making power, what happens is that they actually come up with pretty radical suggestions. So in the context of the UK Climate Assembly, the stuff that they came up with, the recommendations that they come up with, far exceeded anything that was on the government's radar in terms of how radical it was. So taxing frequent flyers, banning SUVs, which is, you know, as far as politicians are concerned, totally a kind of no-go area. So people will come up with really radical stuff if they're informed and you give them some power. So where we can, we should do that. And I'm really sorry we went over, but that's the end of the workshop. If anyone has any questions that they've been sitting on that want me to try and answer, I'll do my best to answer them now. If anyone doesn't, that's cool too.
I just want to say thank you. It was a really good webinar and a good demonstration, very straight to the point and efficient. Thank you.
Thank you, Emily. That's really nice of you to say so.
Yeah, I just want to say thanks, Rick. Obviously, I've been working with Rachel at SWT, and yeah, exactly the same sort of training and sort of process, and you know, fantastic as always. So thank you very much.
Thanks, Barry. And Barry just reminded me, I forgot to give a shout out to people who got the meat question right, and the 35% reduction by 2050. So Barry got it right, and also I think Christiane, who is hopefully still with us, got it right.
Thank you, yes.
for those two, the trophy is in the post. Anyone else have any questions before we quickly say goodbye? No.
Thank you very much. Well,
Thanks, David. It's been a pleasure. So if anyone wants to get in touch with any more questions, my email address is there. If anyone wants to follow us on Twitter, please do so. But again, thank you for coming. I hope you've got something out of it. And I wish you all the best for the rest of your day. And I'm going to attempt to end the meeting. Zoom will let me.
Thanks, Rick. Thanks a lot.
Cheers.
Bye. Thank
Cheers.
you.
Bye-bye.
Bye, everyone.
Bye.
Bye.
Thank you.
Bye.
Bye.